You think a locked door is terrifying? No. True terror is when your safe home becomes a smart cage, and the man holding the password smiles, rubs your back in public, and says you are going crazy. My stepfather thought he built the perfect high-tech prison. He forgot one detail. You never lock up a woman with her secrets, especially when I am the daughter who digs up buried data for a living. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Eva Gardner. I am 32 years old, and I spend my days dissecting digital footprints as a data analyst for Vanguard Cybertech, a private cybersecurity firm. My life revolves around logic, firewalls, and predicting threat patterns. But nothing could have prepared me for the anomaly that breached my personal life at exactly 2 in the morning. I was half asleep when my phone screen flared to life, cutting through the darkness of my bedroom. It was a push notification from a shared family grocery application, an app I was certain I had deleted from my device over a year ago. I squinted at the glaring text. It read, "Buy 3 apples, no questions asked." My blood ran completely cold. This was not a glitch. When I was in high school, my mother, Clara, and I had established a strict emergency protocol. "Buy 3 apples" was our silent distress signal. It meant drop absolutely everything, come find me, and tell no one. I threw on my heaviest winter coat and practically sprinted to my car. The drive to the isolated Blackwood Creek estate in Washington state usually took 2 hours, but tonight, an aggressive blizzard stretched it into a grueling 3-hour nightmare. The snow lashed against my windshield like white static, burying the winding mountain roads. My mother's new home was a sprawling, ultra-modern smart mansion, a fortress of glass and steel nestled deep within the freezing woods. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the imposing structure loomed against the dark sky. I used my emergency biometric access to unlock the massive front door. The moment I stepped inside the foyer, a bone-chilling draft hit me. The ambient temperature was inexplicably low, far colder than it should have been for an inhabited house in the dead of winter. The automated overhead LED lights, which were supposed to adjust smoothly to human presence, were flickering erratically, casting harsh, staggered shadows across the minimalist walls. The sheer, suffocating silence of the massive house pressed against my eardrums. It felt less like a luxury home and much more like a sterilized holding cell. Footsteps echoed down the grand hallway. My stepfather, Arthur Sterling, emerged from the shadows of the living area. Arthur was a highly successful, aggressively flashy real estate investor, a man who usually commanded a room with his tailored suits and booming laugh. Tonight, however, he wore the exhausted, haggard mask of a deeply devoted husband pushed to his absolute limits. He was dressed in a rumpled silk robe, rubbing his temples as if fighting a massive migraine. "Eva," he sighed, his voice heavy with perfectly calculated weariness. "You really did not need to drive all the way out here in this terrible storm. Your mother is just having another one of her paranoid episodes. She was completely frantic, smashing her personal belongings and screaming about the walls watching her. I finally got her to calm down and rest. Please, do not go in there and disturb her sleep. It took me hours to get her to settle." I stared at his perfectly styled hair, noting how his supposed exhaustion did not quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. "I am seeing my mother," I said flatly, my tone leaving absolutely zero room for debate. Ignoring his theatrical sigh of protest, I bypassed him and marched straight down the corridor, pushing open the heavy oak door to the master suite. The room was plunged into near darkness, freezing cold, and stripped of all warmth. My mother, Clara, was huddled tightly into a small ball on the far edge of the massive king bed. She had pulled a thin blanket tightly around her trembling shoulders. Deep, dark circles bruised the delicate skin under her eyes, and her complexion was dangerously pale. She looked fragile, almost broken. But then she looked up. Contrary to the pathetic, delusional picture Arthur had just painted in the hallway, my mother's eyes were piercing, lucid, and intensely sharp. There was no madness in her gaze, only a terrifying, silent urgency. I heard the floorboards creak behind me as Arthur hovered at the doorway. "I will go fetch her a glass of warm water," he murmured smoothly, playing the role of the attentive caretaker perfectly. The absolute second his footsteps faded down the hall, Clara lunged forward. Her trembling hand shot out from beneath the thin blanket and grabbed my wrist with a desperate, crushing grip. Without uttering a single sound, she pressed a cold, heavy object deep into the palm of my hand and forcefully closed my fingers around it. I looked down, feeling the rigid edges biting into my skin. It was an antique, solid brass key. It was a heavy, primitive piece of metal that belonged to a bygone era, an object that was completely and utterly out of place in a sterile smart house operated 100% by voice commands, retinal scans, and digital locks. The sunlight the following morning was a blinding, deceptive white as it reflected off the heavy snowdrifts outside the massive dining room windows. I sat across the polished mahogany table from Arthur, nursing a mug of black coffee, carefully crafting my facial expression into one of exhausted, defeated concern. "You were absolutely right, Arthur," I said softly, staring down at my tightly folded hands. "I had no idea it had gotten this severe. Her mind is just completely fractured. I am going to call my department director at Vanguard Cybertech and request an emergency leave of absence for at least 14 days. I want to stay here, help care for her, and take some of the heavy burden off your shoulders." Arthur paused mid-bite of his heavily buttered toast, a brief flicker of genuine surprise crossing his aristocratic features before smoothing instantly into a flawless mask of benevolent relief. He reached across the wide table, patting my hand with a sickeningly paternal gentleness. "That is wonderfully kind of you, Ava. It has been a truly monumental struggle doing this entirely alone for the past 6 months. Having you here will be incredibly beneficial for her stability, and honestly, good for my blood pressure too. We are family, after all." Beneath his carefully manicured exterior and expensive cologne, I could practically see his massive ego swelling. He was utterly convinced he had successfully manipulated the entire situation, pacifying the protective daughter and bringing me directly under his controlled, monitored domain. He genuinely believed he was the undisputed master of the chessboard. He had absolutely no idea I was already silently dismantling it piece by piece. I waited patiently until exactly 3:15 the next morning. The sprawling house was dead quiet, save for the rhythmic, low hum of the centralized heating system. I slipped out of my bed, locked the heavy guest room door, and unlatched the reinforced titanium clasps of my hard-shell equipment case. As a senior data analyst, my weapons were not physical firearms. They were diagnostic penetration tools, packet sniffers, and custom decryption algorithms. I connected a modified stealth interceptor cable directly into the main wall network port, bypassing the primary wireless router entirely so no unauthorized access alert would trigger on Arthur's administrator dashboard. I booted up my encrypted terminal. Lines of bright green code began reflecting in my irises as I dove straight into the central nervous system of the smart mansion. What I uncovered over the next 2 intense hours made my stomach violently churn. The very first shock hit me right in the chest when I accessed the environmental control logs specifically designated for the master suite. The house network was running a highly sophisticated, hidden script nested deep within the standard home automation protocols. Every single night, starting at exactly midnight and ending at exactly 5 in the morning, the climate control in my mother's specific zone was manually overridden to plummet to a freezing 50 degrees Fahrenheit. I dug much deeper into the local network architecture, bypassing 2 basic firewalls, and found an isolated subnet dedicated to the ambient sound system hidden behind the drywall. There was a scheduled task running a looped audio file. I downloaded a small snippet and played it through my secure earpiece. It was not calming sleep music. It was the faint, rhythmic sound of frantic scratching, overlaid with barely audible, distorted whispering voices. Arthur was systematically orchestrating a technological, psychological torture chamber. He was physically freezing her, piping terrifying auditory hallucinations directly into her bedroom walls. And then, as the security server logs clearly showed, executing a daily permanent wipe of all the internal camera footage from that specific residential wing. He was meticulously erasing the digital evidence of his environmental tampering, ensuring that when Clara complained to doctors about the freezing cold or the phantom noises, she sounded completely and utterly insane. It was textbook gaslighting, weaponized through a multi-million-dollar automated smart infrastructure. The horror, however, was far from over. Tracking the highest-level administrative privileges led me directly to the smart medical dispenser sitting out on the kitchen counter, a device wirelessly linked to my mother's private medical portal. I successfully decrypted the payload data passing between the physical dispenser and the local medical server. The logs revealed a profoundly chilling pattern of unauthorized modifications. Someone logging in via Arthur's personal terminal had intercepted the electronic prescriptions, actively rewriting the dosage command codes. The daily vitamin and iron supplements prescribed by her physician were not actually being dispensed. Instead, the machine had been deliberately recalibrated to drop extremely high doses of heavy pharmaceutical-grade sedatives. He was chemically paralyzing her while systematically breaking her mind, but the lingering, burning question remained. To what ultimate end Arthur was a textbook narcissist, but he was also incredibly lazy when it came to things that did not directly benefit his wallet. Orchestrating a psychological breakdown of this sheer magnitude required immense effort and calculated, daily precision. There had to be a massive, highly profitable motive. I found the final, devastating puzzle piece hidden in the network traffic routing map. By carefully cross-referencing the exact timestamps of when the heaviest doses of sedatives were automatically administered, I noticed a massive recurring spike in outbound data originating from the isolated west wing of the estate. That wing housed my mother's private architectural studio. Clara was a brilliantly talented, nationally recognized structural architect with decades of patented, highly valuable building designs. I furiously traced the outbound data packets. Every single time my mother was knocked entirely unconscious by the altered medication, someone was inside her locked studio, activating the high-resolution architectural plot scanners, gigabytes upon gigabytes of highly confidential, copyrighted blueprints, complex structural integrity formulas, and proprietary foundational designs were being digitized and quietly uploaded to a masked, encrypted external server cluster located completely offshore. I sat back in the dark, the faint, cold glow of the monitor illuminating the sweat on my face. My hands gripped the edges of the wooden desk so tightly my knuckles turned white. This was not merely a case of an abusive husband trying to gaslight his wealthy wife for simple control over a joint checking account. The meticulous theft of intellectual property, the untraceable offshore servers, the systematic, chemical incapacitation of the sole creator of those designs. This was a massive, highly coordinated economic conspiracy. Arthur was stealing her entire life's work, and he was deliberately destroying her sanity to ensure she would never be considered credible enough by any court of law to stop him. The trail of encrypted data packets leaving my mother's studio was the digital equivalent of a bloody footprint. I had the destination IP address, and with a few rapid keystrokes, I identified the hosting provider. It was a poorly secured offshore data haven, but more importantly, it shared a dormant virtual private network tunnel directly with Sterling Developments, Arthur's supposedly thriving real estate empire. He was incredibly arrogant. He assumed his local home network was impenetrable, so he had left his corporate backdoor wide open. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, the rhythmic clacking muted by a heavy winter towel I had draped over my hands and the device. Using a standard brute force injection through a vulnerability in his company's outdated email server, I slipped completely past the corporate firewall. By 4:15 in the morning, I was sitting squarely inside the central financial database of Sterling Developments. I opened the primary ledger, fully expecting to find the inflated profits of a wealthy, greedy tycoon. Instead, I stared into a gaping financial black hole. Arthur was not just broke. He was staring down the barrel of total catastrophic ruin. The hidden transaction logs revealed 5 straight years of reckless, high-leverage foreign exchange gambling. He had lost tens of millions of dollars betting against the European currency markets. To cover his massive margins, he had begun bleeding his own development company dry. But the true horror lay in how he was attempting to fill the massive crater he had dug. I pulled up a subfolder labeled under a heavily encrypted shell corporation named Zenith Holdings. According to the digital incorporation documents, Zenith was entirely owned and operated by Clara Gardner Sterling, my mother. My chest tightened as I scrolled through the massive loan agreements attached to the Zenith file. Arthur had maliciously leveraged my mother's pristine credit and her entire portfolio of highly lucrative architectural patents to secure massive corporate loans from private, unregulated lenders. We were not talking about a small mortgage. The figures glowing ominously on my screen were staggering. He had borrowed $25 million strictly in her name. The patents for her revolutionary earthquake-resistant suspension designs were listed as the primary collateral. But the borrowed money was not sitting in Zenith Holdings. It was being rapidly siphoned through a complex labyrinth of international wire transfers, washed through 3 different countries, and pooled into a private offshore account in the Cayman Islands, an account solely controlled by Arthur. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I dug into the project files Zenith Holdings was supposedly funding. It was a massive development dubbed the Pinnacle Tower, a 70-story luxury residential skyscraper slated for construction in downtown Seattle. I opened the municipal permit applications and the structural engineering sign-offs. They were all stamped with my mother's official digital architectural seal and her electronic signature. I zoomed in on the foundational stress test reports. My blood turned to absolute ice. The technical schematics were a literal death trap. Clara was a fanatic about structural safety. It was the absolute hallmark of her entire 40-year career. Yet, the documents bearing her signature for the Pinnacle Tower explicitly authorized the use of substandard, low-grade steel rebar in the deep foundation pillars, cutting the foundational budget by nearly 60%. Furthermore, the geological surveys detailing an unstable water table beneath the construction site had been deliberately doctored to look perfectly safe. A building of that immense magnitude built on that specific compromised terrain would not just settle over time. Under the right stress conditions, it would catastrophically collapse. He had forged her digital signature to bypass the most critical safety standards of a 70-story skyscraper just to pocket the difference in construction costs. The sheer, psychopathic brilliance of his plan finally crystallized in my mind, hitting me like a physical blow. Arthur was never going to finish the Pinnacle Tower. The moment the project officially broke ground and the final tranche of the $25 million loan was released by the private lenders, he was going to vanish. He would liquidate the offshore accounts and flee immediately to a non-extradition country, leaving the massive debt and the fatally flawed construction site behind. When the private lenders came looking for their money, or worse, when the compromised foundation inevitably failed and the city investigators descended, Arthur would be a ghost, the only person legally, financially, and criminally responsible for the entire disaster would be the sole owner of Zenith Holdings and the architect of record, Clara. And when the authorities brought my mother in for questioning regarding the massive fraud and the forged safety documents, what would they find? They would not find a brilliant, articulate architect. Thanks to Arthur's meticulously documented medical gaslighting, they would find a severely sedated, paranoid woman with a documented history of delusions and violent outbursts. A woman whose own devoted husband had tragically been forced to institutionalize her because she had completely lost her grip on reality. The courts would dismiss her desperate claims of innocence as the frantic ravings of a broken mind. She would spend the rest of her life locked in a high-security psychiatric ward, completely disgraced and heavily medicated, while Arthur lived like an absolute king on her stolen fortune. I glanced at the digital clock on my taskbar. It was 5:30 in the morning. Outside, the blizzard was still raging fiercely, burying the estate in 3 feet of fresh snow, ensuring no one was coming up that mountain road to help us. The automated heating system would be returning my mother's room to a normal temperature soon. I had the digital logs, the intercepted prescriptions, and the forged server data copied to my encrypted drive. But in a court of law, a high-priced defense attorney could easily argue that digital files could be manipulated, hacked, or entirely fabricated by a vengeful stepdaughter who just happened to be a cybersecurity expert. I needed the physical, undeniable truth. I needed the original, untampered blueprints. I needed the handwritten ledgers. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the heavy, solid brass key my mother had pressed into my palm hours ago. The cold metal bit into my skin, grounding me in the terrifying reality of our situation. Somewhere in this sprawling, electronically monitored fortress was a physical lock that belonged to this antiquated key. It was the only thing standing between my mother and total destruction, and I had to find it before Arthur finished transferring the final wire, packed his bags, and called the men in white coats to take her away forever. The roads were cleared just enough by 6 o'clock that evening for the parade of black luxury SUVs to make it up the mountain. Arthur had orchestrated a high society fundraising gala right inside the mansion, inviting over 4 dozen prominent local politicians, zoning board members, and heavy-hitting private investors. The sprawling living room was transformed into a glittering, sickeningly opulent stage. Soft jazz echoed from the hidden speakers. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated with trays of expensive champagne. Arthur was in his absolute element. He glided through the crowd in a custom-tailored tuxedo, playing the role of the tragically burdened but deeply devoted husband to absolute perfection. I watched from the corner of the room as he masterfully worked a group of city councilmen. He would offer a heavy, practiced sigh, rub the back of his neck, and accept their sympathetic pats on the back. To complete his flawless theatrical production, he had strategically left a large, conspicuously labeled amber bottle of my mother's heavy sedatives resting right on the edge of the polished mahogany wet bar, positioned perfectly so every guest ordering a cocktail would casually notice it. It was a brilliant, disgusting stroke of silent manipulation. An hour into the gathering, Arthur practically dragged my mother down the grand glass staircase. Clara looked utterly hollowed out. The exorbitant chemical cocktail he had been secretly pumping into her system made her movements sluggish. Her posture slumped, and her usually brilliant eyes glazed and vacant. She wore a beautiful silk evening gown that hung off her shrinking frame like a shroud. The moment they reached the main floor, the guests swarmed them with polite, overly cautious greetings. Whenever someone directed a question at Clara, Arthur would instantly tighten his grip on her waist and smoothly cut her off before she could even open her mouth. "Clara is just feeling terribly fatigued tonight," Arthur announced loudly to a prominent banking executive, entirely drowning out my mother's faint attempt to speak. "Her doctors say the cognitive decline has been exceptionally aggressive this past month. Some days she hardly even recognizes her own drafting tables. But we are fighting it, aren't we, my love?" He kissed her temple gently. The guests exchanged deeply pitying, uncomfortable glances. The narrative was being cemented right in front of my eyes. The brilliant architect was gone, replaced by a tragic, incompetent shell. I plastered a sweet, naive smile on my face and stepped into the fray. I played the part of the obedient, deeply concerned daughter, fetching drinks and nodding sympathetically at the guests' condolences. But beneath the polite facade, I was meticulously hunting. I identified the core investors, the men and women whose capital was directly tied to the fraudulent Pinnacle Tower project. I gracefully approached a small circle of elite venture capitalists standing near the massive fireplace. After exchanging a few hollow pleasantries, I leaned in with an expression of wide-eyed innocence. "It is truly incredible how much faith you all have in Arthur's vision," I murmured, taking a small sip of sparkling water. "Especially in this current economic climate. A friend of mine in commercial engineering was just telling me how finding high-grade, structurally sound steel for deep foundation pillars has become an absolute nightmare. The costs have skyrocketed by over 60%. It is a miracle Arthur is managing to keep the projected budget so low without compromising the foundational safety protocols. I am sure his financial ledgers and material invoices are completely transparent with you all, right? The warm, jovial smiles on the investors' faces instantly froze. I saw the sudden, sharp calculation in their eyes as they exchanged uncertain looks. The seed of doubt was successfully planted. I excused myself politely and moved to the next group, casually dropping pointed questions about independent auditing firms and offshore liability clauses. I was pouring invisible gasoline all over Arthur's carefully constructed social bonfire. It did not take long for Arthur to notice the shifting atmospheric pressure in the room. His predatory instincts caught the anxious whispers and the suddenly guarded expressions of his financial backers. Across the room, his eyes locked onto mine, just as I finished a quiet conversation with a municipal zoning commissioner. Arthur excused himself from his circle, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles jumped beneath his skin. He strode across the floor, grabbed my upper arm in a vice-like grip that was entirely hidden from the view of the other guests, and forcefully guided me down the corridor. He shoved me into his private study and slammed the heavy oak door shut behind us, engaging the deadbolt with a sharp, angry click. The benevolent, tragic husband vanished instantly, the mask completely shattered. He marched right up into my personal space, his face turning an ugly shade of mottled red, his expensive cologne suddenly smelling incredibly sour. "What exactly do you think you are doing out there?" he hissed, his voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "I am just socializing, Arthur," I replied lightly, keeping my posture entirely relaxed. "Making your guests feel welcome." "Do not play stupid with me, you arrogant little brat," he spat, pointing a thick finger an inch from my nose. "I hear the little questions you are whispering to my board members. You think because you sit behind a computer screen all day typing code that you are smart. You are nothing. I own the politicians in this town. I own the banks. My voice is the only law that matters here. A lowly corporate data cruncher like you could find her career completely destroyed by tomorrow morning. Or worse, people who meddle in my financial affairs tend to have tragic accidents on icy mountain roads. Do you understand me?" He expected me to shrink back. He expected tears, apologies, or at least a flash of genuine fear. Narcissists always expect their targets to crumble under the weight of their projected power. Instead of getting angry, I simply raised the crystal wine glass I had carried in with me and took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark red vintage. I let the silence stretch, forcing him to stew in his own escalating adrenaline. Then, I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was a cold, razor-sharp curve of my lips. I lowered the glass and let my gaze drift lazily down to the heavy, solid gold watch gleaming aggressively on his left wrist. "That is a truly stunning Rolex you are wearing tonight. Arthur," I said, my voice dropping to a perfectly calm, icy whisper. "But you really should be careful. Items that are entirely borrowed, built on debts that do not belong to you, usually come with incredibly fragile straps. It would be an absolute tragedy if that band suddenly snapped, and every single thing you have stolen came crashing down to shatter on the floor." The color instantly drained from Arthur's face, his breathing hitched, and for a fraction of a second, raw, unfiltered panic flashed across his eyes. He took an involuntary half-step backward. The absolute certainty that he was the smartest man in the room had just been ripped away from him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The foundation of his entire criminal empire had just developed a massive, unfixable crack, and he knew I was the one holding the hammer. I turned my back on him, unlatched the deadbolt, and walked out of the study, leaving him standing entirely alone in the suffocating silence of his own making. By 5:30 the following morning, the atmosphere in the house had shifted from suffocating to actively hostile. I had packed my equipment and walked downstairs to the front foyer, intending to move our cars closer to the garage before Arthur woke up. I pressed my hand against the biometric scanner next to the massive front door. A harsh red light flared. The digital screen flashed a solid error message reading "System Override," the heavy magnetic locks. usually responsive with a satisfying click, remained dead and immobile. I ran to the kitchen entrance and then to the patio doors. Every single exit was sealed shut. Arthur had completely disabled the magnetic locking mechanisms from an external administrative point. We were literally caged. I ripped my cell phone from my pocket. 0 bars. The persistent, reassuring icon of my secure mobile network was completely gone. I sprinted back to my diagnostic terminal and ran a rapid sweep of the local frequencies. Nothing. The digital void was absolute. Arthur had activated a high-grade electromagnetic signal jammer. The entire estate was now a sealed, isolated black box cut off from the rest of the world. My eyes darted to the master control panel on the wall. Catching a final cached notification right before the local network had been severed, it was an automated gate clearance log. Arthur had authorized entry for a private psychiatric transport unit and a specific, highly controversial local doctor, scheduled to arrive at precisely 6:30 this morning. The reality of his endgame crashed down on me. The confrontation in the study last night had accelerated his timeline. He was not waiting for the building to break ground anymore. He was executing the final phase today. He was going to physically drag my mother out of this house, throw her into a private ambulance under the authority of a heavily bribed physician, and have her locked inside a psychiatric ward before the morning sun even fully rose. Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw at my throat. I spun around to run upstairs and barricade the master suite, but I stopped dead in my tracks. My mother was standing at the bottom of the glass staircase. She was not wearing the thin, trembling blanket. She was not hunched over. Clara stood perfectly upright, her shoulders pulled back with the commanding presence of the master architect she had always been. The vacant, heavily drugged glaze that had clouded her eyes for half a year was completely gone. Her gaze was as sharp as cut glass. "Mom," I breathed, my voice barely a whisper in the silent room. "He thinks I swallowed them," Clara said. Her voice was steady, dropping the frail, breathy tone she had been forcing for months. For the past 3 months, every single night, I hid those massive sedatives right under my tongue. The moment he turned his back, I spit them into the potted plants. I let him think he was breaking my mind. Ava. It was the only way to make him careless. It was the only way to survive until you figured out the code. My mind reeled, struggling to catch up with the sheer, brilliant resilience of the woman standing before me. She had orchestrated her own counter-illusion right under the nose of a sociopath. She walked briskly toward me, holding out her hand. "The key. Ava, give it to me. We are entirely out of time." I placed the heavy brass key into her palm. Clara did not lead me to her high-tech studio or the master bedroom. Instead, she walked directly to the massive, decorative faux stone fireplace dominating the center of the living room. She knelt beside the hearth, her fingers expertly tracing the grout lines of the seemingly solid masonry. "Technology can always be compromised," she murmured, pressing hard against a specific, jagged piece of slate. Arthur relied so heavily on his digital locks and his firewalls that he completely forgot about the undeniable security of simple physical mechanics. The heavy stone panel slid back with a harsh grinding noise, revealing a dark, narrow cavity in the wall. Tucked deep inside the brickwork was an old-fashioned, heavy steel combination safe. It possessed no digital keypad, no biometric scanner, and zero connection to the compromised electrical grid. Clara slid the brass key into the central lock and spun the mechanical dial with practiced precision. The heavy steel door swung open. Inside rested 2 items. The first was a thick, waterproof cylinder containing the original, hand-drawn and physically stamped blueprints of the Pinnacle Tower, completely unaltered and proving her original safety specifications. The second was a rugged, solid-state hard drive. I installed a hidden, analog audio recorder under his desk the day I realized my account balances were shifting, Clara explained, pulling the drive out and handing it to me. "This contains hundreds of hours of raw audio, every extortion call he made to his offshore bankers, every conversation he had with the corrupt zoning officials, and the explicit recording of him bribing the private doctor who is on his way here right now." The wail of a heavy siren pierced the quiet morning air, echoing violently against the mountain ridges. I bolted to the window. Through the swirling snow, I saw the flashing red and white lights of a private medical transport van pulling up to the main gate. Right behind it was Arthur's massive black SUV. He had not slept in the house. He had left in the middle of the night to physically escort the extraction team. The heavy tires crunched loudly over the frozen driveway. The vehicle slammed to a halt right in front of the sweeping porch. The front door's digital lock chimed, a sharp, artificial sound that signaled Arthur using his primary administrative override code. The heavy deadbolts retracted with a loud, final clack. The massive door swung open violently. Arthur stepped into the foyer. He was no longer wearing the tailored tuxedo or the mask of a caring husband. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. In his right hand, gripped tightly by the leather handle, he carried a heavy, solid iron golf club. He stepped into the house, his eyes scanning the room, fully prepared to use brute force to smash my computer equipment or strike me down if I dared to physically stand in his way. He smiled a cruel, victorious smile, utterly confident that his trap had snapped shut and his birds were finally caged. Arthur stormed into the living room, swinging the heavy iron club in a wide, threatening arc. "Step away from her, Eva," he roared, his voice echoing violently off the high ceilings. "The medical team is here. You are completely out of your depth." His wild eyes darted across the room and locked onto my specialized diagnostic terminal sitting on the coffee table. The screen was still glowing with strings of decrypted code. Assuming I was desperately trying to download the last of his files, Arthur let out a guttural yell and lunged forward, raising the golf club high above his head to smash the hardware into a million useless pieces. I did not panic. I did not even try to protect the equipment. I simply took a calm step backward, pulled my smartphone from my pocket, and tapped a single command key. Instantly, the massive 80-inch flat-screen television mounted above the fireplace flared to life. Arthur froze mid-swing, the heavy club hovering just inches above my keyboard. He stared at the screen in absolute horror. This was not the local police dispatcher. The display was split into a dozen high-definition video feeds. Looking back at Arthur from the screen were the shocked, furious faces of his entire corporate board of directors, the core private investors he had desperately schmoozed just hours prior, and a stern-faced special agent from the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Division. "When you activated your signal jammer to cut off the house," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the room, "you forgot who you were dealing with. My company uses independent, military-grade satellite uplinks. You did not lock me out. You just locked yourself in." I gestured to the tiny, blinking red lights on the high-definition security cameras tucked into the corners of the ceiling. "I reverse-hacked your own surveillance grid. Arthur, every single word you just said, your armed threat, and the physical evidence of the original blueprints my mother just recovered from the wall safe have been live-streaming directly into the emergency shareholder meeting you conveniently skipped this morning." He had built his own perfect stage, and I had simply turned on the lights. The villain had orchestrated his own downfall with his staggering arrogance. Exactly 5 minutes later, the wail of heavy sirens tore through the morning fog. 3 heavily armored state police cruisers skidded across the icy driveway, completely boxing in the private ambulance. The bribed psychiatrist took one look at the flashing lights, dropped his medical bag, and tried to sprint for the tree line, only to be immediately tackled into the deep snow by a state trooper. A squad of heavily armed officers breached the front door. Arthur dropped the golf club, his hands trembling violently as they slammed him against the wall and snapped cold steel handcuffs around his wrists. The lead detective read out the charges in a booming voice: aggravated corporate fraud, extensive forgery, and unlawful imprisonment. As they dragged him toward the door, all of his manufactured bravado completely vanished. Arthur turned his head frantically, locking eyes with my mother. His face crumpled into a pathetic, weeping mask. He begged her for mercy, sobbing that the financial stress had clouded his judgment and that he truly loved her. Clara did not flinch. She did not raise her voice or offer a single word of forgiveness or anger. She simply walked calmly past him toward the front door. As she passed, she reached into her pocket, pulled out the empty amber bottle of heavy sedatives, and let it drop. The plastic bottle hit the hardwood floor and rolled to a stop right against his expensive leather shoes. 4 months later, the chilling memories of that smart mansion felt like a distant nightmare. My mother and I stood together on the sun-drenched balcony of a beautiful, airy apartment in a vibrant new coastal city. There were no hidden microphones, no electronic chimes, and no automated locks controlling our every move. There was only the warm breeze and the sound of the ocean. Inside, Clara's drafting table was covered in fresh, brilliant sketches for a brand new, independent art center. She was finally free. Many people believe that women remain silent because they are terrified. They see submission where there is only strategy. What they do not understand is that some silences are never about endurance. They are simply the necessary time required to meticulously calculate the wind and the trajectory before finally pulling the trigger. My stepfather thought he had built the ultimate high-tech prison to keep us locked in the dark. But in the end, the only thing he managed to lock away forever was his own life. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Maya Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.